For 30 long years, the rusted iron mailbox at the end of Cobblestone Lane never held anything but dry autumn leaves and the occasional stray feather. It belonged to a man who genuinely believed the entire world had forgotten him. Until one freezing November morning, a single crisp white envelope miraculously appeared, addressed in a familiar, sweeping handwriting he had not seen in over 2 agonizing decades. "Hello, my dear friends. Come in, and sit by the fire. The nights are getting much colder outside, and there is nothing quite like a good story to warm the soul. If you enjoy stories that warm the heart and leave you with a valuable lesson, subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales and become part of our storytelling family. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading every comment. Now, let me tell you about Arthur Pendelton. Arthur was a master clockmaker. If you walked past his little stone cottage on the edge of the village, you would hear the relentless, comforting heartbeat of 100 different clocks. There were tall, proud grandfather clocks made of rich mahogany, tiny, delicate mantel clocks of gleaming brass, and wooden cuckoo clocks that sang out the hour with joyful wooden birds. Arthur spent his days surrounded by time, yet he was a man entirely frozen in it. You see, Arthur could fix any broken gear, any shattered glass, and any bent spring. He was a master of repairing broken things. But the one thing he could not fix was his own shattered family. 20 years ago, on a night much like tonight, with the rain lashing against the windows and the wind howling down the chimney, Arthur and his only son, Thomas, had a terrible, heartbreaking argument. Thomas did not want to be a clockmaker. He had no passion for tiny gears or the quiet, lonely life of a watchmaker's shop. Thomas loved books. He loved people. He wanted to be a teacher. He wanted to travel to the city and stand in front of a classroom, shaping young minds instead of shaping metal. But Arthur, driven by a stubborn, foolish pride, refused to listen. He told his son that if he walked out of that door, he should never bother coming back. And Thomas, with tears in his eyes, had picked up his suitcase and walked out into the pouring rain. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and a profound, suffocating silence fell over Arthur's life. It was a silence that not even the ticking of 100 clocks could ever drown out. Years turned into decades. Arthur grew old. His hands, once steady and strong, began to tremble slightly. His hair turned as white as the winter snow. He closed his shop in the village and retreated to his cottage, living a life of quiet, solitary regret. He never reached out to Thomas. His pride, though slowly crumbling into dust, still held him captive. He would often sit by his window, staring down the long, empty road, secretly hoping to see a familiar silhouette walking toward him. But the road remained empty. Then came that freezing November morning. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and a bitter wind was whipping through the bare branches of the oak trees. Arthur was sitting in his armchair, sipping a cup of bitter black tea, when he heard the faint, unexpected crunch of boots on the frosted gravel outside. It was Leo, the village postman. Leo was a cheerful young man with a bright red scarf and a smile that could melt the winter ice. Arthur watched through the frosted window pane as Leo walked up to the old iron mailbox, lifted the creaky lid, and slipped something inside. Arthur's heart gave a strange, violent flutter. He waited until Leo had cycled away down the lane, before he slowly rose from his chair. He wrapped his thick wool cardigan tightly around himself and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind tugged at his white hair as he walked down the garden path. His trembling hand reached out and opened the mailbox. There, lying stark against the rusted metal, was a crisp white envelope. Arthur picked it up with fingers that felt completely numb. He stared at the front. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the elegant, sweeping script of his son Thomas. A sudden wave of absolute terror washed over Arthur. He had waited 20 years for this moment, but now that it was here, he was utterly paralyzed. What did the letter say? Was it full of anger? Was it a final, cruel goodbye? Had Thomas written to say he never wanted to see him again? The weight of the envelope felt like a boulder in his fragile hands. Arthur hurried back inside the cottage, locking the door behind him as if trying to keep out the very truth he held in his hands. He walked over to the fireplace and placed the white envelope on the wooden mantelpiece, right next to a ticking brass carriage clock. He backed away from it, his breath catching in his throat. For 3 entirely agonizing days, Arthur did not open the letter. He went about his daily routines like a ghost haunting his own home. He wound the clocks, he boiled the kettle, he ate his meager meals of bread and soup. But his eyes were constantly drawn back to the mantelpiece. The white envelope sat there, silently demanding his attention, mocking his cowardice. It was a bridge to his past, and he was absolutely terrified to cross it. By the 4th day, the silence in the cottage became unbearable. Arthur needed to speak to someone. He needed a voice that wasn't a ticking clock. He put on his heavy wool coat and his flat cap, and he walked the 2 miles into the village. The village was bustling with people preparing for the coming winter. Arthur kept his head down, avoiding the eyes of his neighbors, until he reached the warm, inviting glow of Martha's bakery. Martha was a kind, sturdy woman with flour dusting her apron and a heart as warm as her ovens. She was the only person in the village who still occasionally checked on Arthur. As Arthur pushed open the heavy wooden door, a little brass bell jingled merrily. The air inside smelled heavenly, a rich mixture of cinnamon, rising yeast, and melted butter. Martha looked up from kneading a large mound of dough and smiled warmly. "Arthur Pendelton," she said, wiping her floury hands on a towel. "It has been far too long. Come sit by the radiator. You look half frozen." Arthur sat down at a small wooden table in the corner. Martha brought him a steaming cup of sweet tea and a warm cinnamon bun. She sat down opposite him, her kind brown eyes studying his pale, worn face. "What is it, Arthur?" she asked softly. "You have a look about you. A look like a man who has seen a ghost." Arthur stared down at his tea. "I received a letter, Martha," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry leaves. "From Thomas." Martha gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Arthur, after all these years? That is wonderful news. What does he say? How is he?" "I don't know," Arthur confessed, a tear finally escaping and rolling down his wrinkled cheek. "I haven't opened it. It's sitting on my mantelpiece. It's been there for 4 days, Martha. I am too afraid to look inside. I am a cowardly old man." Martha reached across the table and gently took his trembling hands in hers. "Arthur, you have spent your entire life fixing broken clocks. You know better than anyone that time does not stop for any of us. You can wind a clock back, but you cannot wind back your life." Whatever is in that letter, it is the truth. And the truth is always better than living in the dark. You must go home and open it. My dear listeners, if you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people who need a little inspiration today. Arthur left the bakery with a renewed sense of courage, though his heart still hammered violently in his chest. As he walked back along the country road, the sky began to darken ominously. Heavy, slate-gray clouds rolled over the hills, and the first thick flakes of winter snow began to fall. By the time Arthur reached his cottage, the ground was already covered in a blanket of pristine white, and the wind had turned into a bitter, howling gale. He stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat, and walked straight to the mantelpiece. He looked at the envelope. He took a deep breath, reaching out his hand. He was finally ready. He would face his past. He would read his son's words, whatever they might be. But as he picked up the envelope, he realized a terrible problem. In his anxious state over the past few days, he had misplaced his reading glasses. He searched the kitchen table, the bedside stand, the bathroom sink. Nothing. He could not read a single word without them. Then he remembered. Last week he had walked down to his old abandoned clock shop in the village to fetch some specific gears for a repair. He must have left his glasses on his old workbench. Arthur looked out the window. The snowstorm was rapidly intensifying. It was becoming a full-blown blizzard. The wind was shrieking around the corners of the cottage, rattling the window panes. It was dangerous for an old man to go out in such weather, but a desperate, burning fire had been lit inside Arthur's soul. He had waited 20 years. He could not wait one more night. He bundled himself up in his thickest scarves, grabbed his sturdy wooden walking stick, and tucked the precious white envelope deep into the inside pocket of his coat, right next to his heart. He opened the door and stepped out into the raging white storm. The journey was agonizing. The wind pushed against him like a solid wall, trying to throw him off his feet. The snow blinded him, stinging his face like tiny needles of ice. His legs ached, and his chest heaved with every difficult breath. But he kept pushing forward, driven by the memory of his son's face, driven by the overwhelming need to know the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the old dark storefront of his abandoned clock shop. His frozen fingers fumbled clumsily with the rusty keys, but at last the heavy door groaned open. Arthur stumbled inside, shutting the storm out behind him. The shop was freezing, completely dark, and smelled heavily of dust, old oil, and polished brass. It was a graveyard of time. Unfinished clocks sat under dusty white sheets like silent ghosts. Arthur slowly made his way to the back room, his boots leaving wet footprints on the dusty floorboards. He found a half-melted wax candle on a shelf and lit it with a trembling match. A small, warm pool of golden light flickered to life. And there, sitting perfectly on the edge of his old, scarred wooden workbench, were his reading glasses. Arthur sat down heavily on his old stool. The silence of the abandoned shop pressed in on him, heavy and thick. Outside, the blizzard howled, but inside, the world had shrunk down to the small circle of candlelight, an old man, and a white envelope. He took the letter from his inside pocket. He put on his glasses. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and with absolute agonizing slowness, he slid his thumbnail under the seal of the envelope and tore it open. Inside, there was not one letter, but two. One was written on thick, expensive cream paper, filled with beautiful, unfamiliar handwriting. The other was a small, folded piece of lined notebook paper, yellowed at the edges. Arthur pulled out the small, yellowed paper first. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Thomas's writing, but it was shaky, uneven, as if written by someone who was very weak or very tired. Arthur held the paper up to the flickering candle flame and began to read. "My dearest father," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that my time in this world has finally run out. The doctors tell me I only have a few weeks left. My heart, the very thing you used to say kept a person ticking, is failing me." Arthur gasped, a terrible, agonizing physical pain tearing through his chest. He gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles turning stark white. Thomas was gone. His son was dead. He had waited 20 years, and he was too late. Tears immediately flooded Arthur's eyes, blurring the ink on the page, but he forced himself to keep reading. "Father, I am writing to tell you that I forgive you. I forgave you many, many years ago. I was angry when I left, but as I grew older, I realized that your anger that night came from a place of deep fear and love. You only wanted to protect me. You wanted me to have a safe, predictable life. But I had to find my own path. I became a teacher, Father, and I want you to know that every single day I used the lessons you taught me. You taught me patience. You taught me that every tiny, seemingly insignificant piece has a vital role to play in the grand design. You taught me that broken things can always be carefully mended. I used your wisdom to help broken children find their purpose." A small, choked sob escaped Arthur's lips. His son had not hated him. His son had carried his memory, his lessons, out into the wider world. The letter continued. "I have built a wonderful life, Father, but there is one piece of my life that has always been missing, and that is you. My greatest regret is that my foolish pride kept me from walking back down Cobblestone Lane to knock on your door. Pride is a terrible thief, Father. It steals the time we are meant to spend with those we love. Please, do not let pride steal any more from you." Arthur's hands shook violently as he reached the final paragraph. "I am sending this letter to you through my daughter. Yes, Father, you have a granddaughter. Her name is Lily. She is 20 years old, and she is the brightest light I have ever known. I have told her endless stories about the brilliant clockmaker who can make time sing. I have asked her to find you, to deliver this letter, and to check on you. Please, Father, welcome her, love her. Let her be the bridge that brings our family back together. With all my endless love, your son, Thomas." Arthur dropped the letter onto the workbench. He buried his face in his trembling, calloused hands, and he wept. He opened the letter and immediately burst into tears. He wept for the 20 lost years. He wept for the harsh words spoken in anger. He wept for the son he would never, ever see again. The grief was a physical agony, a crushing weight that forced him to his knees on the dusty floorboards. He cried until there were no tears left, until only a hollow, exhausted ache remained. But as the tears finally subsided, something miraculous happened. A strange, unexpected warmth began to blossom in his chest. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Thomas was gone, but he had left behind a precious gift, a granddaughter. A piece of Thomas was still alive in the world, and she was coming to find him. Arthur picked up the second letter, the one written on the thick cream paper. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and precise. "Dear Grandfather," it read, "my father spoke of you every single day. I miss him terribly, and he told me that you are the only person in the world who might understand my grief. I am traveling from the city. I will be arriving in the village on the noon train this Sunday. I sincerely hope you will open your door to me. Yours affectionately, Lily." Sunday? Arthur's head snapped up. He looked wildly around the dark, dusty shop. He ran to the front window and peered out through the raging blizzard. Today was Friday. She was coming in less than 2 days. Suddenly, the crushing weight of Arthur's old age seemed to miraculously vanish. He had a profound, urgent purpose. He gathered the letters carefully, placing them back in his inside pocket, closer to his heart than ever before. He grabbed his walking stick and marched back out into the freezing storm. The journey back to the cottage felt entirely different. The wind was just as fierce, the snow just as blinding, but Arthur did not feel the cold. His blood was pumping with a fierce, joyful energy. He was going to be a grandfather. When he burst through the door of his cottage, he did not sit down to rest. He immediately began to work. For the next 36 hours, Arthur Pendelton worked like a man possessed. He scrubbed the wooden floors until they gleamed. He polished every single piece of brass until it shone like captured sunlight. He dusted the grandfather clocks. He cleaned the windows. He washed the curtains. He baked a loaf of fresh bread, something he had not done in a decade. He walked to the village market on Saturday morning and bought fresh butter, sweet strawberry jam, and a small, delicate bunch of winter snowdrops, which he placed in a crystal vase in the center of the table. He wanted the cottage to look perfect. He wanted it to look like a home filled with life, not a tomb filled with memories. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a breathtaking, glittering winter wonderland. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue. Arthur dressed in his absolute best suit, a dark wool three-piece that smelled faintly of lavender soap. He combed his white hair neatly. He stood by the window, watching the road, his heart beating a rapid, frantic rhythm against his ribs. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the noon hour, a small, dark shape appeared at the very end of Cobblestone Lane. Arthur held his breath. As the figure drew closer, he could see it was a young woman. She was wearing a bright yellow coat that stood out beautifully against the pristine white snow. She carried a small leather suitcase. Arthur stepped out onto the porch. As the young woman reached the garden gate, she stopped. She looked up at the cottage, listening to the muffled chorus of ticking clocks. Then she looked at Arthur. Arthur felt the breath catch in his throat. She had Thomas's eyes, kind, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She had his smile, a smile that crinkled at the corners. "Grandfather?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly in the crisp winter air. "Lily," Arthur whispered. Tears immediately sprang to his eyes again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming, unadulterated joy. He walked down the snowy path, his arms wide open. Lily dropped her suitcase in the snow and ran to him. They collided in an embrace that erased 20 years of bitter silence in a single, beautiful second. Arthur held her tightly, breathing in the scent of cold air and sweet perfume, feeling the solid, living reality of his family returned to him. "He loved you," Lily whispered against his shoulder, her own tears soaking into his wool coat. "He loved you so much." "I loved him too," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever knew how to say. Come inside, my dear. Come inside. You must be freezing. I have tea and fresh bread and I have so much to tell you." Arthur led his granddaughter into the warm, ticking cottage. As he closed the heavy oak door behind them, shutting out the cold winter wind, the silence that had plagued Arthur for 2 decades was finally broken. The cottage was no longer filled just with the mechanical ticking of clocks. It was filled with the sound of a boiling kettle, the clatter of teacups, and the beautiful, ringing sound of genuine laughter. Arthur Pendelton spent the rest of his days teaching Lily the delicate, intricate art of clockmaking, and in return, Lily taught Arthur how to live again. She brought light back into his dark corners, and she showed him that while you cannot ever change the past, you can always choose what you do with the time you have left. And that, my dear friends, is the story of the letter that changed everything. It is a powerful reminder that pride is a very heavy burden to carry, and it will eventually crush the person holding it. Time is the most precious thing we possess, more valuable than any gold or silver. We must never waste it on anger or stubbornness. We must spend our time building bridges, saying, "I love you," and forgiving those who have stumbled, for we all stumble sometimes. A kind, forgiving heart is the truest compass a person can have in this journey called life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales for more timeless tales and endless wisdom. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you learn from today's story?